Hello everybody. I think we'll make a start. These things always have a habit of overrunning anyway, so I'll just introduce the webinar and hopefully everybody will be able to join us in the next few minutes. So hello and welcome to our latest CYCJ webinar. My name is Charlotte Morris and I'm delighted to introduce you today to Professor Sean Redmond and Dr Paul Rigby, who'll be delivering today's webinar on child criminal exploitation. As you may be aware, today is National Child Exploitation Awareness Day, so we felt that this was a very timely date to hold our seminar. We are keen to raise awareness, as so many of us are, of serious and organised crime and child criminal exploitation activity, including child sexual exploitation and child trafficking that's taken place across the UK and Ireland, and especially increasing during the pandemic. And we want to look at, this is a webinar to look at what the current situation is and also the child protection responses that are happening and that we can learn from. As we know, child criminal exploitation is often unrecognised, which means that children are more likely to be prosecuted for offending behaviour than recognised as victims of exploitation. So it's something that's very concerning and that we want to raise awareness of. This webinar follows on from our conference in 2019 November, which we did on serious and organised crime and child criminal exploitation, and Professor Redmond spoke at that, so we're delighted to welcome him back today. There'll be a chance to ask some questions at the end depending on where we get to, and I think Sean and Paul are very happy to be emailed with any further questions that we don't get through. We'll be recording this video and this webinar, and I'll be sharing that with you, hopefully, and any other related resources. So without, oh yes, and if you're going to be tweeting about this, if you could try and use the hashtag CYCJ Webinar and also CEA Day 21, I think. So without any further ado, I shall hand you over to Sean, who will be doing our first talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlotte, and thanks so much for the invitation to talk to your conference. Could I just check with the thumbs up that you can hear me okay? Holly, can you hear me okay? Great, great stuff. I'm just going to share a screen now. Holly, again, I just might check whether that's been shared. Is that okay?
Yep, all good.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks again for the invite. My name is Sean Redmond. I'm actually a professional social worker and a civil servant with the Department of Justice in Ireland. I'm assigned to the University of Limerick to help understand the evidence base for progressive reform for youth justice policy in Ireland. And before we get into the necessary technical detail, I want you to imagine this boy. He's stuck in a toxic ecosystem, a situation that he didn't choose to be born into. He lives in a backwater housing complex. His daily life is experienced in a criminalised bubble. It's a bubble created and sustained by the criminal gang that governs his estate. He is subject to continual coercive control. His parents do not protect him because they're compromised by the drug debts owed to the network members. All his friends share the same experience. They nearly think the same way, mostly in compliance with the criminal norms encouraged by the network that he's part of. Because while they're exploited, they're also part of the regime that exploits others. This child gets no protection from the community. He's seen as a criminal first and a child second. Also, many of the residents in the estate he lives in are paralysed into stoicism. Understandably, they choose not to bring the problems on themselves for complaining to the authorities about antisocial behaviour and crime on their doorsteps. But this is a child, not a crime statistic or a character on a computer-generated network drawing like the ones I'm going to share with you soon. He has a human right to be protected from exploitation. This conference is called Lifting the Lid, and I take this to mean shining a light on a hidden problem. Professor Malcolm Sparrow from Harvard University refers to hidden problems as a special category of harm, and note that he uses the word harm and not risk. That's best only partially disclosed by the existing evidence. This means that we need to source new and possibly unconventional evidence. So in a moment, I'm going to tell you about how from a very modest beginnings, we now understand more about the circumstances of children like this in Ireland and what we're planning to do about it. But for a second, let's just think about this child and his burden. So in talking about lifting the lid, I'm going to briefly outline how we found out about criminal child exploitation in Ireland. Also about how we examined crime networks to get a better picture of what was going on, about how we build responses to the situations that we found, and a few updates on progress since the last time I checked in with colleagues in Scotland and some next steps. And really, with this opportunity, I kind of thought about it, and I've never really told the backstory about how we lifted the lid and how we started from a very low base, but it may be of interest to colleagues in this conference. So back to 2008, and I was appointed as the head of young offender programs in the Irish Youth Justice Service. In the Irish Youth Justice Service, there were specialist local youth projects delivered alongside the Garda organisation, the Garda being the Irish Police Service. This was a foundational programme across Ireland and it was at a cost of about €16 million at the time. And as you can see, 100 projects dotted across all of the main towns and cities across the country, a really good coverage. Now, I got to visit each project as part of my 6-month induction and documented every visit, which involved detailed discussions with frontline youth practitioners and police officers. I wanted to understand what youth crime looked like in each local area and make sense of the national crime patterns by stacking these local narratives together. Alcohol-related public order crime was by far the highest cluster of offences, so I started sketching the narratives of how youth crime occurred, location by location, based on the evidence provided by frontline practitioners. When I look back at these sketches now, they have a vintage Mickey Mouse cartoon look to them, but they were really important. And from what we know now about how to address wicked problems, trying to capture the size and shape of a problem and what makes it tick is really, really important. At this point, we had no reports or statistics on children involved in crime networks, only anecdotes. The first intelligence then came from systematic consultation with youth workers and local juvenile liaison officers from An Garda Síochána across Ireland. And it was a lesson for me, really, that the systematic gathering of tacit knowledge and practice wisdom that was held by frontline practitioners is like gold when normal data sources are poor and the problem is hidden. As I went around these projects documenting frontline professionals' sense of local crime patterns, a minority of children whose offence patterns were different began to emerge. Typically, these children were involved in robbery, burglary, and in some manner drugs for sale and supply. You can see how different these descriptors were in their tone and consequence: exposure to adult criminal associates, a sense of enclave, networking, debt and threat and menace. But just to be clear, we use these offence categories as point of difference or a window in the crime data to highlight a minority of children whose context we simply didn't understand, a group of children who in the international criminological literature are often known as the right-hand tail. It was simply a way of avoiding the noise of all offending by young people, which in Ireland is mainly episodic and transitory. We wanted to examine further any patterns of child-adult co-offending and children who may need more help than they were currently getting. We also used logic and common sense to track down patterns of atypical youth crime. One thing we knew from burglary offences was that they were atypical and associated with higher volumes of offending. We then predicted there may be adult involvement for functional reasons. So in relation to burglary, particularly in country areas, it may have been intelligence about where to burgle, conveyance to get to and from burglary sites, and also fencing goods as well. In relation to drugs for sale and supply, obviously, because children were involved in the retail end of this, there would be adults, and we predicted there'd be adults involved in sourcing the drugs in the distribution, and also for protection of children at a local level. Police analysts produce a national league table by police sub-district of all children involved in burglary and drugs for sale and supply. And here's the top 20 of about 320. We anonymised all the sub-districts with colours. We chose Greentown because it was the first sub-district outside of Dublin, and we felt that this was likely that the young people would be less anonymous, that young people were less likely to cross sub-districts in terms of being able to gather data, and also that police respondents, who were our main data source for this research, were likely to have been in post longer and to know their patch. This is called exceptional sampling in the methodological literature, and what we were trying to do was to identify in these the case locations where we thought it might give the clearest examples of any patterns of behaviour. Once we landed in Greentown, police analysts linked individuals over a 12-month period who were co-detected, mainly for burglary, which are the green lines, and drugs for sale and supply, which are the red lines, in a 12-month period. This is how the Greentown network, with all its limitations, came into being. The key building block for Greentown, for the Greentown study, is Twinsight, and the researcher's job was deeper examination of these statistically constructed networks using qualitative methods and interviewing specially selected local Garda with huge tacit knowledge of the individuals involved. Twinsight required a police analyst to produce two versions of the network map. Version A, on the left as you look at it, is used by the researcher. Each individual is given a unique identifying reference such as A2. Version B, on the right as you look at it, has the same unique identifiers, but in addition, it also includes the real names of the individuals involved. This version is only ever seen by the police. As a research team or a researcher, I only know that A2 is A2. The police officer knows that A2 is Sean Redmond, but we only both refer to him as A2. In the location being examined, 20 to 30 police respondents who have lots of knowledge about the individuals are specially selected to take part in an interview, usually for about an hour. In the interview, there's a physical space between the interviewer and the respondent. To help mitigate bias, we encouraged officers to ground all their opinions in facts and events that could be corroborated with other accounts. And using Twinsight, we can zoom out to see patterns of behaviour and relationships, and zoom in to make explicit individual narratives to offer very detailed accounts of relationships. I suppose as a way of caution, it's worth bearing in mind that all of these are based on observations by frontline police officers, but our experience now over 3 to 4 years work in this area is that the data is very rich. This is what it looked like in practice. And this, truthfully, is the game that inspired the Twinsight approach. So in sum, Twinsight is a very important tactic in lifting the lid that cost virtually nothing extra. I think if we tried to access these stories in the traditional way, we'd have been still stuck in discussions about ethics and data access. These were the keys to unlocking or lifting the lid on the hitherto hidden children and their toxic exploitative relationships and environments. And irrespective of the safeguards, this was a huge leap of faith for the Irish police or An Garda Síochána. We replicated this qualitative study 3 times, and building on the evidence and also moderating the initial evidence from the first case study. But also on this slide, we have a prevalence study where we surveyed a national team of over 120 juvenile police officers with vignettes taken from the Greentown study. And from the survey, we estimate that there could be up to 1,000 children across Ireland who are at risk of involvement in crime networks. From this point, we were in a position to make evidence-informed assertions. We were able, for instance, to paint this picture in Greentown of children involved in closed friendship networks, befriended and cultivated by mid-ranking young adults who in turn were governed by individuals higher in the pecking order. We called these relationships associate because they referred mainly to criminal collaborations or based loosely on friendships. We also noticed another type of relationship, which we called family. This was because they belonged to a dominant family and kinship group in the neighbourhood. These actors got the associates to do the work and take the risks, and young people in the family group appear to be higher in the network than some associate adults. The relationships within the family and kinship network were much stronger and more resilient to interference than the associates. Twinsight helped us to really understand the multiple adversities bearing down on the young person we met at the start of this presentation and his friends, and start thinking what we could do about it. We did have a little bit of help. Here are our design collaborators who worked with us for almost 2 years, international experts who are academic leaders in understanding illicit networks and organised crime. These external experts helped us to figure out what was going on in Greentown. And very important in terms of lifting our lid was to ask them to comment on our analysis, not their own from their own jurisdictions. We also had our own Irish experts in policing, child welfare, probation, youth interventions, law and policy, and community development. Our national experts who know the Irish context much better helped us to stress test our emerging ideas with real life experience and to hopefully avoid too many unintended consequences. This was another tactic for closing the evidence gap. Incidentally, we will be continuing to cultivate and develop these networks as the Greentown programme is trialled, and we are creating a national group with other interested communities to share our findings and learn from our experience. We identified 2 key outcomes for any Greentown programme, and we wanted purposely to keep this really simple. The first was to reduce the influence of criminal networks on child offending, and secondly, to improve pro-social outcomes for children who are already involved. So our evidence base for the new Greentown programme includes knowledge of the international programmes which appear to have efficacy in reducing network influence and helping children to exit. Secondly, the primary research undertaken in Ireland that I've just described. And thirdly, an expert-led deliberative design process. After lots of thought, this is our evidence-informed mission with flexibility and agility, and it's not a prescribed programme. This simplified conceptual model is adapted to suit local conditions. Network disruption, based on network analysis provided by my colleagues in the university, police will use legitimate means to disrupt certain influential individuals linked to the recruitment of children. A ring-fenced budget has been secured to support community efficacy or activities that boost pro-social voice in the community. A ring-fenced budget has also been secured to give effect to pro-social opportunities, by which we mean individualised training, education, social enterprise plans for young people who are already embedded in a crime network, who signal that they want to leave. And fourthly, an intensive family programme. This is a high-intensity intervention at family level with very capable practitioners and low caseloads, perhaps only 1 to 5, over a long period of time. This part of the programme is modelled on a highly effective bail programme that we developed in Ireland using multisystemic therapy embedded in the programme. And at strategic oversight, these pillars will operate in unison, but will be regulated by a local multi-agency management. The core of this group will be police, probation, child welfare, and the NGO provider providing the intensive family programme. And of course, we're not certain about whether this will work, and this is why we're trialing the approach. There are so many moving parts, but we think, based on the evidence that we've collected, that this has the best chance of loading the dice in favour of the children involved. I'm going to finish now with a few short updates, and I'll be happy to take questions after that. The first update talks about this intervention, where the Greentown programme has been awarded €4.2 million, awarded to a trial in 2 locations over 3 years. The contracts have been awarded to the NGO providers to actually deliver these programmes now, and the sites have now commenced. Only COVID-19 is stopping us from immediate engagement. So my colleagues Catherine Norton and Jane Mulcahy will undertake a network analysis of 2 new locations, which we've called imaginatively Yellowtown and Whitetown, and they'll use this data, this picture of the problem in these 2 locations to offer referral information for the 2 local advisory committees. The University of Limerick, who I work for and Catherine and Jane work for, will actually be scientific advisors to the programme, and we see this as being a much more supportive and collaborative role rather than just going in at the end and undertaking an ex post evaluation. The second update refers to legislation, and this is legislation that's currently going through the Oireachtas, or the Irish parliamentary process. So this legislation is the Criminal Justice Exploitation of Children in the Commission of Offences Bill. It's a specific offence where an adult compels, coerces or induces or invites a child to engage in criminal activity, and that those found guilty of the new offences face imprisonment of 12 months on a summary conviction and up to 5 years on indictment. The child concerned does not have to be successful in carrying out the offence for the law to apply, so the focus is very much on the adult. It's prosecutable as a completely separate offence and an additional offence to any crime committed by the adult using the child as their innocent agent. So of course we're not sure how effective this will be, and there are inevitable assumptions about how any legislation will work, but it does put the exploiter in the spotlight, and we will certainly be trying to support this on the ground when we when we support the trial sites. The next update then refers to publication, and the studies that I've been referring to there that have been undertaken by Catherine, Owen and myself are all now available, and I've sent the links to the conference organisers. And finally, something which was a nice early Christmas present is that Greentown was awarded the European Crime Prevention first place in December of 2020. And as you can see, Ireland is there, the wee black bear in the middle with the tricolour on top of it. So it was a nice thing to get. I'm going to finish where I started. When we lifted the lid, we found a reasonably small number of children involved in crime networks, and their lives are miserable, and their confinement compounds their misery and poverty of expectations. They deserve better, and alongside our partners for the next number of years, our mission is to try and do something to improve their situation. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that, Sean. Paul, if you could just turn your video on now, and then I'll share that with the group. Fantastic.
You're muted, Charlotte.
Sorry, everybody. I was muted there. I was just saying that if you have questions now for Sean and Paul, please just well, after Sean's talk, if you want to send them through in the chat function, and we'll deal with all questions after Paul's spoken, if that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, is that on your screens?
No, I don't think so.
Right, okay, let's try again.
No worries.
How about that?
Yep, in 2 seconds it'll be live.
Brilliant.
There you go.
Are we all on now then? That's showing?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much, Holly and Charlotte, and thanks, Sean, for the insight and the oversight into what's been happening in Ireland. I propose today just to look at it from a Scottish perspective and really ask the question, for child criminal exploitation, where is the child protection response in Scotland? And I don't know if this applies to Ireland as well. I've had some discussion with Sean around this. So my background is actually, I mean, it's really good to be asked to do the presentation today and linking with Sean and the CYCJ, because my background is criminal justice and youth justice, and then moved into child protection, child trafficking, and really it feels like it's come full circle now as we start to explore child criminal exploitation. So the purpose of today is for me to raise questions, really, in many respects, far easier job than Sean in terms of not presenting any findings. I just want to raise some questions from the Scottish perspective. Trying to lift the lid is difficult in Scotland because we don't have any research at the moment around child criminal exploitation. But I know there are plenty of people who are maybe listening today that are working in this area that have come across cases of exploitation of children. So what I want to do really is just start with the question, where is the child protection response? I'll finish with that question and I'll give some thoughts in terms of where we are in Scotland. But I really want to locate it within a lot of the work I've been doing around child trafficking and using that as a framework, but also to look at some of the tensions, the broader tensions in terms of working with children. And this, the quote from Barry Goldson has been taken from a piece of research I did back in 2014 that was looking at children who were involved in violent sexual behaviour and who were subject to MAPA registration. So again, in 6 or 7 years, it feels like it's probably come not full circle, but we're starting to join the dots. And I'm particularly interested in a lot of the intersectionality between youth justice, child protection, and moving more and more into the serious organised crime, which is not my area of work, but it's something that I'm now starting to link into because of the child criminal exploitation aspects of it. And what we do know from over the years in Scotland, and clearly applies elsewhere, that at this interface of crime and potentially violent crime and child welfare, there are a lot of tensions, and it's that tension, the care, welfare, control, punishment, and as Barry said, it's finely balanced, if not strained. And that's probably where we are at the moment, and more strained because we really don't have a good insight into the extent or the level of child criminal exploitation in Scotland. And I think Sean's presentation is a really good example of good piece of research or pieces of research that can develop the evidence base and link directly into practice and work closely with the police and other agencies while undertaking this. And it parallels much of the work I've done. And interestingly enough, when I was listening to Sean there, this was started, the Greentown project started around the same time that we started to look at child trafficking in Glasgow when I worked in Glasgow. So that the progress, the timeframes have been the same. So it's interesting, within that 12 or 13 years, we're now coming at it from a similar but different perspective. What I want to do first and foremost, look at some of the obligations we have towards children under UNCRC. And this is a particularly useful time to look at this in Scotland, given that we've got the bill moving through Parliament now in terms of the incorporation of the UNCRC into Scottish legislation. And that's going to be a crucial time in terms of what our obligations are, but it's also a crucial time to have a look at some of the issues and some of the critique around these obligations and where we are in Scotland and wider. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops over the next few years and how it can be implemented. And if we just look at Article 29, one of the issues I've had for a number of years is we still apply adult criminal justice system to 16 and 17-year-olds in Scotland. So it will be interesting to see how that develops over the next few years once UNCRC is fully incorporated into our legislation. But jumping above to the Article 19, for the purposes of today, we have a clear obligation to protect all children from all forms of abuse or exploitation, however that's defined. And there's no caveat to this in terms of whether they're involved in offending behaviour or not. And that's what I want to touch on today and ask the questions for the audience, for the Scottish members of the audience, but also on a broader perspective as well. So we have a number of obligations that we need to take into account, and clearly they'll become much more embedded in Scottish law over the next few years. But taking a step back from obligations into practice and even policy and guideline developments, we have a complexity here. We have a vulnerable and risky population. We have a perpetrator and victim population. When young people are involved in child criminal exploitation when young people are involved in youth offending. They're neither just violent offenders or children in need. It's the intersection between both of these, and that's one of the difficult areas that we've had over the years to try and develop the coherent policy and practice approach, as Garabino in 2020 talked about. And I'll come back to that later, to that study, because it's really important in terms of the work that as I was preparing for today, to locate this intersectionality aspect again. And that's what I've found interesting over the years since I started the work on child trafficking, how the different aspects are starting to be joined together now. And Sean picked up already on some of this in his talk in terms of the way family work and family programmes starting to be introduced much more with young people involved in offending behaviour and sometimes violence. And really, as I started in 2007, 2008, looking around child traffic, and at the same time I was working at the University of Edinburgh with the Criminal Justice Development Centre, and we looked at a piece of work then around young people involved in sexual behaviour, sexual offending, and we applied the UNCRC to the practice in Scotland at the time. And this is what I'm starting to do now in terms of trafficking and criminal exploitation, because when we look deeply, when we start to uncover some of the issues, we find that the compatibility with some of UNCRC articles is not always there. Young people, 16 and 17-year-olds, were subject to MAPA registration. They were subject to the adult system. And what we argued at that point was this can be problematic in terms of meeting their rights as children, especially when they weren't also subject to parallel either child protection or children's hearing support. So the question was raised then, and again, as I say, full circle back to raising that question again. And reference here to Carleen Furman, some of the excellent work she's been doing over the years on contextual safeguarding. And Sean talked about context. Context is clearly important in terms of where the young people are coming from and the little case study he gave of the young person. But Furman has talked around about redefining what we understand by child protection, what we understand by exploitation. And clearly contextual safeguarding has informed some of my thinking over the last few years in this respect, but it also links back to some of the other work that I have been involved with. So again, this aspect of intersectionality to uncover the complexities and try to look for some solutions, both in practice, but also in policy and guidance. And that's one of the important aspects that we need to take account of. It's the intersectionality across the different aspects. So in terms of Greentown, Bluetown, Redtown, in terms of Sean's work, but also Anytown, and I'm talking about Anytown in Scotland perhaps, or Anytown anywhere in that respect. And I pulled this little quote out from the research. And the reason that I've pulled this quote out will become apparent in a minute when it links to some of the work that I've been involved with. I've highlighted some of the terms here. And the reason I've highlighted some of the terms is because it links very clearly to the work that I've been involved with around child exploitation, child trafficking, and the link to child abuse, then the link to child protection responses. What we see within the words here, and it's very clear and apparent throughout Sean's work and the reports, that there are parallels with exploitation of children that would fit in with trafficking definitions and legislation. And I'll come back to this later in terms of why it's important in terms of when we're looking at child criminal exploitation. And the reason it's important is around choice and agency, which is crucial to understanding the situations young people find themselves in, but it's also crucial in understanding how we respond to young people in these situations. So I'm leaving that there as trafficking definition stroke legislation, just to return to that later. And for those of you familiar with the definitions and the legislation, that the highlighted words there will be very familiar, and we'll start to make those links in terms of the way we approach these different aspects of young people's lives. But before I just move on to more discussion around trafficking and exploitation, I'm going to raise this as another question. This might be controversial. I've never tried this before, so I'm raising it at this point in time. And I'm not the first to raise it. As I mentioned earlier, the Garbarino study, but also a Bristol study back in University of Bristol study or report back in 2013. So if we're applying different lenses to the criminal behaviour of young people in Greentown or Redtown or Anytown, and we're applying a exploitation or a child protection lens, could we not also apply the lens of child soldiers, youth violence and youth gang members? Is it all child criminal exploitation? I would argue there are very clear links there. And I would also argue, and Garbarino's also made the same argument, in terms of youth gang members or youth violence or child criminal exploitation, perhaps they should be included as a protected group under the UNCRC as our child soldiers. And both of these reports are clearly stating, while it's not clear, full 100% equivalence, there are many parallels between child soldiers. And if we look at child soldiers and we look at child trafficking internationally, we don't have any problems in applying a protection or a child protection safeguarding lens to that. But do we have a problem in the UK and potentially Ireland in applying a child protection focus to people who are involved in potentially violent behaviour? So I raise this as another question and another lens. And for anybody who's heard me talking before, I quite often raise other lenses to look at different issues, and it links directly to some of the work of Carleen Furman in terms of the context. We need to redefine the context if we're working with children, and if we hope to meet obligations under the UNCRC, we have to explore all the different possibilities that can provide support to young people. But crucially, and I think this is a particularly important point, at no point am I arguing that they don't need to be responded to in terms of their violent behaviour and their risk. And it's that challenge that I've mentioned earlier between the risk that they may pose to other people and the risk and the vulnerability to themselves. And unfortunately, I believe over the years, we've not been able to square that circle. We haven't been able to manage to work with that dichotomy. But I think some of the important work that's coming through now, and Sean's being part of that, and the contextual safeguarding work, people now feel a lot more confident in drawing the parallels and trying to approach this from different perspectives. And that's really the purpose of my input today, is just to raise these questions, how we can approach that. So the child soldier one, be interesting to hear views on that one. It's really the next stage in my thinking around some of these issues and why we're not approaching this in the same way. And potentially, as Garbarino's asked, why are they not incorporated into the CRC as youth gang members, etc. And one of the reasons I believe the labels and the categories that we ascribe to children and young people really have influence on how we respond. And generally, under neoliberal governance, we like to separate children and young people or others into particular groups that we can then respond to in particular ways. And that's one of the reasons over the years that we've struggled to see children who are involved in violent behaviour as children who are also in need of care and protection. It may be within the same system, and in Scotland, clearly that's possible in the children's hearing system. But in the child protection system, we've now come to realise, and work of Carleen Furman in that respect, if we approach it from a different context and we look at the context of the child protection issues, we now know it's not only within the family. And that's why now we can have these discussions and we can have agreements or disagreements in the way that we respond to children and young people. So the discrete labels that we apply are not particularly helpful, but if we apply a safeguarding and child protection label, but also recognise that may include violent behaviour to others, we can start to unpick some of the complexities we can start to work with it. And going back to my trafficking definition stroke legislation in terms of Greentown, Bluetown, I think it's particularly useful because within the legislation in Scotland, England and Wales, and I'm not sure about the legislation in Ireland, but legislation definition of trafficking starts to erode this idea of young people's consent and choice for the situations that they're in. So even if they choose to be involved in criminal gangs within that context of constrained choice, the trafficking legislation, the definitions, the responses can override that to a certain extent. It can still be exploitation, even if the young people are agreeing to that. And on the broader perspective, UNODC back in 2012 did an excellent paper around trafficking, child trafficking, and looked at the abusive position of vulnerability. And if we put young people's lives, and Sean touched on this, if we look at the context or the concept of vulnerability, we can start to unpick some of these issues of harm being done to children and young people, and then also doing harm to other people at the same time because of their vulnerability and their situations. So in that respect, we need to redefine exploitation, and that links into the contextual safeguarding where we're redefining child protection. So again, the intersectionality between these different angles is particularly important. So I'll draw to a close now with 3 points that I think, or I believe, where child protection is at the moment in this debate around child criminal exploitation, around child trafficking, around child sexual exploitation. It seems that quite often the protection of children from harm is lost amongst the focus on the harm they cause. And if we look at child trafficking in Scotland at the moment, we look at the case studies of Vietnamese young people who have been picked up in cannabis farms and are being prosecuted through the criminal justice system. So we're looking at the harm of growing cannabis as opposed to the harm to the children. And that's changing now. We're becoming more aware of that. So I think that's one area where the child protection focus is being lost. I often think it's lost in the legislation, the policy and the guidelines. And what I mean by that, the rhetoric of the legislation, the policy and the guidelines is not translated into practice. And I'm thinking that as one of the issues where child protection's gone. But the recent work we've just undertaken in Scotland into child trafficking and to look at some of the responses. Child trafficking in Scotland, or the policy, legislation and the guidelines, are internationally held up as an area of good practice. But what we found was the good practice guidelines are not always translated into practice. So for me, the child protection response in practice needs to be looked at, because I believe in Scotland we do have good systems. We have a children's hearing system, we have a good child protection system, we have excellent legislation, policy and guidelines. So the challenge is to implement that into practice so that children are being treated as children in practice, and it's not just detailed in the guidance, in the legislation and the policy. We will be forced down this route with UNCRC being incorporated into legislation and into practice. So now is the time to start looking at this through a different lens so that we can do what is right for children in Scotland and also be a beacon of good practice for other areas. So I'll finish there. Thank you for listening. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Make sure I'm off mute there. Thank you so much to Sean and to Paul for two fantastic, really thought-provoking talks. They both went so fast, you know, I feel as and we, you know, there's so much more that could be said. So I really appreciate it, giving you time up today to come and talk to us. I think now we have quite a bit of time for questions, if that's okay. So I'm going to take my video off and remain on mute. And I think if people want to send in questions, let me just see if anything's come through. Can you see anything there, Holly?
Yeah, I think we've got a couple. So I think the first few are for you, Sean. So I'll put your video live so you can answer them. So there's a question regarding the children from the study. Were there any common features of their backgrounds that might suggest increased likelihood of becoming involved in child criminal exploitation?
Could you just say the last part of that question for me, Holly? I missed it.
Sure. Were there any common features of their backgrounds that might suggest increased likelihood of becoming involved in child criminal exploitation?
Yes. And actually, it was kind of initially kind of touched on in the Greentown report, but I think probably more in my colleague Dr. Catherine Norton's report into Redtown. What we found with the case study is that we were kind of building on the evidence base, and so Catherine found certainly indicators there, which probably are no surprise to anybody. So children who are extremely disadvantaged, they would score very highly in relation to all the ACE scores, but in addition, some of the families where children were involved, particularly in things like burglary offences, would have been families within a disadvantaged situation who would have been viewed as multiply disadvantaged, so even disadvantaged within a disadvantaged kind of situation where there may have been parental mental health or drug issues. And of course there's a kind of an added vulnerability with parents where there's a drugs misuse that we also found in the Greentown report. It is that within these kind of contexts, they precipitate relationships with other people involved in these crime networks, which are based on obligation. So, sometimes when you look at these kind of networks, they look like these kind of flat structures, but the minute you get involved in servicing debt or get into debt with any of the important players, they create these kind of relationships based on obligation. So yes, there were, absolutely.
That's great, thank you. The next question we've got, a question for you, Sean. How would you be planning on measuring outcomes for the children and young people?
Okay, it's a really good. It's a really good question. I suppose the first thing to say is that when we've looked internationally at these programs, if you look at the kind of 4 pillars involved in the Greentown program, there are programs that probably cover 1 or 2 of those pillars. What we've not seen is are any programs that cover all 4 of them, so it's incredibly ambitious. We're into kind of theoretical space here, as well as stuff that's based on programs that have been shown from an evaluation point of view to work. We're actually currently, perhaps what I should have said is that the programs are very recent. We've just appointed the providers for the programs, and we're working now with the multi-agency committees on the ground in these local areas, and we're developing, for anybody who knows about evaluation, you can have these kind of experimental designs where you provide the service for some children and not for others. We think for a whole host of reasons that kind of certainly orthodox kind of experimental design won't work. So we're looking at things like contribution analysis, where we can try and identify the contribution that the program has made to the 2 objectives of reducing network influence and helping children who are currently stuck to get out. But importantly, what we're doing is we're building a theory of change, and we're doing that with the actual providers and the people who are involved in the program. So we have some ideas about what kind of things may be of interest, and for these children, the first thing often that you need to create is a sense of safety. So from from a sense of safety, where they are able to kind of start thinking, using their kind of cognitive skills rather than just acting out of fear. How do we move forward from there? So we have some ideas about what that trajectory might look like, but we've been very clear that really that theory of change is going to be developed and mapped alongside the stakeholders.
Thanks very much, Sean. I've got another question for you, if that's okay. I'll move over to Paul. I am interested in how the legislation in Ireland was developed, what stage this is at, what has been the support, and when is it expected to be implemented, and what supports will be needed to support its implementation.
The answer to that, Charlotte, is for most of those kind of questions is I don't know. It's involved in that kind of black box now of being processed through Parliament. What I would say is that it has majority support. The thing I like about it is that it's targeted, it's clear, and you know, as I say, it said in the presentation, it very clearly places the kind of spotlight on the exploiter, and is very, very kind of clear about that. It doesn't kind of fudge this idea of the child committing the offence. It really does identify the exploiter. I don't know what the I don't know where it's at in terms of that process, but I do think there is fairly kind of consensual support for it. Also, I'm not sure what the resources will be required to implement it. One thing that was said in the press release for the legislation when it went through was that the minister drew on the Greentown research, which perhaps is maybe of interest to colleagues in Scotland, but drew on the research as providing an evidence base for the new legislation, and probably similar to colleagues in Scotland or governance in Scotland. You know, there's the idea around evidence-informed policy programs and practice is pretty ubiquitous in Ireland as well. I have to say, I think probably the impetus was there either alongside or before the research that we produced, so there may have been some serendipity there, because the legislation is probably the culmination additionally of lots and lots of community effort as well, you know, in terms of developing the legislation. I'm sorry I can't be more specific about that. As I say, it's in this kind of murky world at the moment. But the important thing is that it does have a huge amount of support.
Okay, thanks very much, Sean. Paul, I think this one is for you, if that's okay to switch over to Paul there. What, in your opinion, do we need to I assume, to translate the good guidance into practice?
Oh yes, if you knew the answer to that, I'd be a millionaire. I think the clear part of it is, touching on what Sean just said as well, actually, is we need better evidence base, because at the moment we have the good legislation and the evidence base is not always keeping up with the legislation and the policy. So, and I would say that as a researcher, obviously, but we do need to develop the evidence base, and especially around child criminal exploitation. But I think part of it is a change of best way of describing it. It's a change of thinking. It's a new way of thinking around work with children who are involved in violent behaviour, and also in terms of the discussion that the answer that Sean just gave in terms of some of the backgrounds of the children and young people. It's about not seeing young people on a trajectory into either crime or into a trajectory of victimhood, but also they may be crossing over between both of those. And until we can start to see young people as young people and not as their labels as criminals or as victims, we may be able to start working a little bit better with the complexities in their lives. So and this is incumbent on all of us, whether we're policymakers, researchers or practitioners. We all have to this step change in thinking. And if we look at the contextual safeguarding work of Carleen Furman, that started the process, but we still have to have that conceptual practice leap. It's a leap of faith in many respects for those of us who've worked in, I mean, I'm as guilty as anybody. I worked in youth justice with 16 and 17-year-olds 20 years ago. I never considered them as children at that point in time, and clearly UNCRC was still there. So it's a long process, but we've started the process in Scotland clearly, and in Ireland they're starting to look at it as well. So it's, again, I use the term intersectionality. It's starting to look at that, but also realise that if we treat children, or if we approach children who are violent in the same way that we treat any child or approach any child working with them, that can help to support them in all different aspects of their lives. So it's not just a focus on the behaviour. And it's if you go back to some of, you know, the original, the Kilbrandon philosophy, we talked about needs, not deeds. I think we need to look at needs and deeds. It's two sides of the same coin. Violent behaviour against children and violent behaviour by children can't be separated out into two different approaches. So it's just that conceptual. It's a different way of thinking. I do think we're on that treadmills pejorative. We're on that mill at the moment where we are heading down that route, but it's not going quickly enough, perhaps. And again, the UNCRC is going to force our hand on this now if it's fully incorporated, and all authorities have to pay cognisance to it. I think it may be coming quicker than we think. But on the positive note is, you know, in Scotland, I do know we are having the discussions and looking at this from different perspectives.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. I've got another question for you. I'm curious as to the development of the Exploitation of Children and the Commission of Offences Bill, as it seems to resemble UNCRC/OPAC requirements on the criminalisation of the recruitment and use of child soldiers. Are there any other examples of laws like this in other countries that were used to inspire this bill? Quite a lot in that one, so we need to repeat any of it.
I'm not, because it's an Irish bill, I'm not over familiar with it. Right. It certainly links into UNCRC. You can see even the articles that I put up on my presentation, and the report, the Bristol report and the Garbarino article are starting to make those links, and they talk much more clearly about links between different aspects of, well, UNCRC and different countries' legislation. But I mean, I can see the parallels there, but I don't know enough about the Irish bill to be able to expand any further on that. I don't know if Sean can help out with that one.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, I've kind of shared what I know, Paul, about the bill going through the Oireachtas at the moment, and as I say, I mean, I think that the inspiration for the bill came very much from politicians and their experience at local level, particularly in city areas, the capital, but also, as I say, I mean, which I think was important for us as a research team trying to provide practical evidence that could support reform. They drew on the studies, or certainly the minister said that she'd drawn on the studies that we'd done in Greentown, Redtown, and Bluetown.
Okay. Is there anything else to add there, Sean?
No, sorry.
That's great. That's okay. Thank you. To interrupt you. Let me see what I've got here. I've got one here. I'm not quite sure who would be best to answer this. I'll just ask you, Sean, and we can pick that up. Is there any evidential/research regarding differences in reporting of child sexual exploitation by gender? For example, within the County Line's operational model, drug dealing, the focus for males appears to be on CCE, whereas females' evidence of CSE will also be a consideration. This bias appears to potentially skew data and negates that males are also victims of CSE, and the motivation for this behaviour by perpetrators can be used as a form of coercion and control rather than a sexual motivation.
It sounds like that one was asked by somebody who probably knows the answer, Charlotte. So I don't know if they want to kind of share that. What I would say, and this it in some way kind of talks about the kind of the gender bias on this. A lot of the data that we used was sorry, to build our qualitative studies was framed by using police detection data, which, as you know, probably falls down 1 to 10, 1 to 9 in relation to between males and females. So our studies have tended to profile mainly young men who are involved in this. It is something that we're attuned to, though, in terms of you know, how girls and young women may be drawn into network collaborations, or what role they may play in networks as well. But I think the kind of questioner has probably pointed to something which is a blind spot.
Okay, thank you very much. That's us just about to hit 2 o'clock, so I don't know, I think we might stop the questions there. I've got a lot of questions coming in, and they're all really good. But I think the best thing to do is perhaps just to make sure that we're on time. I know people are busy, so I will just switch to my video there. So I will thank Sean and Paul for an absolutely fantastic webinar. As I say, very thought-provoking, fantastic to have it today of all days. Our next step will be, I'm going to email out the slides that I can, and also this recording as well. And if you would like your questions to be answered, I think the best thing to do is I'm going to suggest that you email them to me in response to my email, and I'll get them to Sean and Paul, and they can see how they want to respond to them. I think that's probably best. So thank you very much for joining us. I really hope that you enjoyed it and it was worth your while. And our next webinar is on May the 13th with Stuart Allardyce from Stop It Now Scotland. And we'll be sharing details of that on our website and e-bulletin. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye now.
Thanks.